It's my great pleasure to introduce the Comptroller of the United States, the 7th Comptroller of the United States, David M. Walker. Mr. Walker has a CPA, and he spent many years working first for Price Waterhouse, then for Coopers, then for Price Waterhouse and Coopers when they combined, as you went from the Big 10 to the Big 8 to the Big 6, and then worked for Anderson before he was appointed in 1998 to be Comptroller General. Comptrollers General, by the way, serve for a 15-year term. They are nominated by the President and then, well, pretty soon, by a majority vote, advised and consent approved by the Congress. The 15-year term is intentional because the role of the Comptroller General since the founding of what was then GAO, and starting this year has changed its name in ways that we'll talk about in a second. The whole purpose is to get someone who's insulated from politics and political pressure so that that person can lead an organization that speaks truth to power, specifically the Congress of the United States, and does not fear as much as the typical person who works for the Congress, none of whom have civil service ranking, that they will be kicked out the door by telling the truth. Okay. David Walker has done two things that I think are very important. One is that he has continued a trend and really accelerated a trend to move GAO into the 21st century. GAO was founded as essentially as an organization that would be an accounting firm for the Congress and for the government of the United States. And over time, and particularly the last 2 to 3 Comptrollers General, have said that's not good enough. What we really have to do is build analytic and intellectual capacity. We have to attract people with MBAs, with PhDs, with actually masters in public policy degrees to build the analytic capability, and therefore what we really want to be is an accountability office where we analyze government programs to see whether they are fulfilling their mission and whether they are cost effective and maybe even pass a benefit cost test. And so he has continued doing that. And part of that is the name change of the organization that occurred last summer. The other thing he has done, quite nobly, and in this I must say it's like the Bill Murray movie Groundhog Day. He wants to, and he will show you today because I skimmed through the slide presentation, he wants to scare the hell out of you. And that is because the fiscal situation of the United States approaches that if you take it seriously. And so he has become a prophet, hopefully not in the wilderness, but maybe in the wilderness, to try to convince the American people that we are at a very dangerous point in terms of the financial condition of the United States. When I went to work for CBO, I was employee number 3, the Congress had just reformed its budget process because we had a $15 billion deficit, and it was necessary to do something about that. Now it was a smaller government, so as a percentage that was higher. I left CBO in 1980. We had been so successful we were in about $80 or $90 billion deficit by then. And that then ballooned to over $400 billion, which was over 6% of the gross domestic product in the 1980s. And then, and here I think I want to scare you even more than the Comptroller General will, because I want to make some political comments. We had 3 politicians who, indeed Knox's notion of leadership, sacrificed their careers. 3 national politicians who sacrificed their careers to do what was right and got 0 credit from the American people. The first one was Robert Dole, who in 1982, as chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, essentially rebuilt the fisc, increased taxes when the Reagan administration really didn't want to, in order to do something about the deficit. In 1988, he ran for the Republican nomination for the president and was slaughtered in New Hampshire because he refused to take the pledge that he would never raise taxes. The second one was the person who beat him in New Hampshire in 1988, George Herbert Walker Bush, who, as you remember, in 1990 moved his lips and agreed to a compromise with the Democrats that both raised taxes and did some spending cuts. And if you look at it in constant dollar terms, that did more than anything anybody else had done or did in the future to eliminate the large federal deficits of the 1980s. Now, those are two Republicans. And as you remember, George Bush was never forgiven by the right wing of the Republican Party for raising taxes. Newt Gingrich voted against it. Okay? The third one was William Jefferson Clinton, whose administration backed a tax increase in 1993 and got it through the House of Representatives and the Senate without a single Republican vote. And in the Senate, it passed by Al Gore breaking the tie as vice president. And that plus health care caused the Democrats to lose the Congress for the first time in 40 years. So here's an example of what Dean Knock talked about in terms of political leadership. And that resulted, and I've skimmed through the slides, and you will see actually one of the rare periods in recent American history where we had budget surpluses. After the election of 2000, this is my view, politicians learned the lessons of Dole, Bush, and Clinton. Namely, that there was no political credit to be gained by eliminating deficits. And we have gone from very large surpluses to very large deficits that the Comptroller General will show you in a period that's probably worse than it was in the 1980s, because we are now facing demographic changes that the Comptroller General will also show you that means where we're really in bad shape. And those of us who lived through the 20 years to do something about that and saw good politicians of both parties sacrifice their political careers to do things that were good for the country at large really do despair and really do look to people like the Comptroller General, who is in a position to make recommendations and advice to try to shake up the Congress of the United States. So today he's going to tell you about the nation's growing fiscal imbalance, perspectives and issues, and on top of that, I'll tell you it's worse than he said, because the politics is such that it's not clear anybody really wants to do anything about it. But he can make recommendations, so maybe he'll tell you how to do that as well. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce David M. Walker.
It's a pleasure to be here at Berkeley. I've had the opportunity to be here 2 or 3 times in the past. Dean Knock, thank you very much for your kind comments. John, thank you for yours as well. I think it's important to note that we at GAO, which is now the Government Accountability Office, have a number of graduates from Cal, including from the Goldman School, and we hope that those numbers continue to increase in the future. And so I will say that. What I'd like to do is the following. My very capable staff has put together the obligatory PowerPoint presentation, and so I want to be able to make a few points based upon this presentation. I think that they will be thought-provoking, and I hope that they will end up stimulating a number of questions. I'm not going to cover all this material. I'll have a few points about each one, but some of these have graphics in them, and as they say, a picture says 1,000 words. And I think they can provide a pretty clear and compelling picture. This represents a one-page summary of the 100-page plus strategic plan for the GAO. It's the closest thing that exists to a strategic plan for the United States, because the executive branch doesn't have one and never has. The executive branch deems the budget submission to be the strategic plan. With all due respect, a one-year budget is not a strategic plan. And that's part of the problem that we have in Washington, and it's been this way for many years. It's not just the current administration, that we tend to have 2 afflictions in Washington: myopia, or nearsightedness, and tunnel vision. The combined effect of myopia and tunnel vision is that makes it tough to think strategically, and it makes it tough to try to be able to work across boundaries. The left-hand side represents themes or trends that have no geopolitical boundaries in today's world. The red represents our goals. two of which are tied to the Constitution, one of the few documents that people can agree on nowadays. And then the foundation represents the core values that help us to make sure we do our job right. This represents the latest update of GAO's high-risk list. These are high-risk programs, policies, functions, and activities in areas in the government that are more susceptible to fraud, waste, abuse, and mismanagement, or that are in need of fundamental transformation. Interesting, the Department of Defense has 14 of 25 high-risk areas. Our military is the best in the world. There's nobody even close. My son is a captain in the Marine Corps who fought in Iraq. I'm proud of that. I had appointments to Naval and Air Force academies, couldn't go at the last minute because of a left ear, so I believe in a strong defense. But while our Defense Department is an A+ on fighting and winning armed conflicts, it's a D graded on a curve, giving them the benefit of the doubt on economy, efficiency, transparency, and accountability. Billions of dollars are wasted every year. And just because it's defense and just because it's homeland security doesn't mean it's prudent and doesn't mean it's necessary. Now, let's talk a little bit about where we've been, where we are, and where we're headed. I am a certified public accountant, and please remind me before I get done today to mention something about Arthur Andersen, because I noted that we're in the Arthur Andersen auditorium, and I'd like to address that if I can. But let's stick with this right now. 40 years ago, roughly, in 1964, almost half of the federal budget was for national defense. Fast forward 40 years, last year it was down to about 20%. It would have been about 17% but for Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, where did the money go? Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. In fact, if you look back in '64, you won't see any of the red, which is Medicare and Medicaid, because they didn't exist until 1965. The past cannot be prologue. This trend cannot continue. Another way to look at it is in 1964, when Congress came to town, they got to decide how 2/3 of the budget was spent. That's the discretionary spending. By the way, discretionary spending includes national defense, homeland security, education, transportation, judicial system, public health, a few things that I would say are pretty important, some of which are in the Constitution of the United States. Fast forward 40 years, less than 60% of the budget is decided on each year. More and more the budget is on autopilot. 40 years ago, 7% of the budget was for interest. Last year, 7% was for interest, but not for long, because we're adding debt at record rates and interest rates are headed up. And so as a result, this cannot continue as well. Now last year, if you take the numbers in the financial statements of the U.S. government last year, and the number that you'll hear politicians talking about is the 412 number. By the way, these are billions, 9 zeros put behind this number. $412 billion deficit, 3.6% of the economy. Not an all-time record. We had higher deficits in the 1980s. But what's important is not where we are versus where we were, it's where we are and where we're headed. And so people that say, well, gee, we've had higher deficits in the past, I don't take much solace in that, because what's important is where we're headed. But quite candidly, what concerns me is the $412 billion number, while from an economic standpoint might be a relevant number to talk about, from the standpoint of fiscal responsibility, I would argue it is not. The number to look at from a fiscal responsibility standpoint is the $567 billion number, because we took $155 billion of temporary surpluses. A vast majority of it was the $151 billion Social Security surplus. We spent every dime on it on other government expenses. We replaced it with bonds that are backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government, guaranteed as to principal and interest. The government will deliver on those bonds. They have political, legal, and moral significance. They have no economic significance whatsoever. When those bonds have to be paid off, you're either going to have to raise taxes, cut other spending, or increase debt held by the public. And by the way, if you look on the financial statements of the U.S. government, the bonds that are held by the Social Security and Medicare trust funds are not shown as a liability of the U.S. government. Why? Because the left hand owes the right hand. Don't get me wrong, the government will deliver on them, but that shows you a problem. So $567 billion, 4.9% of GDP, now we're getting close to record territory. Now this is what's happened in the last 40 plus years with regard to deficits. Red being on budget, meaning the operating on budget deficit typically. Blue being off budget or the Social Security surplus primarily. Black line being the net. You'll see that we didn't have a very good track record until the 90s. We had a few periods of temporary surpluses. Let me underline the word temporary. Even during the period of time where we had surpluses, we knew they were temporary based upon GAO's long-range budget simulations. Why? Demographic trends, the retirement of my generation, the baby boom generation, and rising health care costs. So we knew they were temporary. Unfortunately, the decisions that were made resulted in significant increases in the deficit. By the way, of the deficit last year, even if you go with the $412 billion number, only about $100 billion relates to Iraq, Afghanistan, and incremental homeland security cost. So of the $412 billion net deficit or the $567 billion operating deficit, only $100 billion relates to Iraq, Afghanistan, and incremental homeland security cost. Many would lead you to believe that that's why we have deficits. Not true. It's only $100 billion of the total deficit. Furthermore, we haven't been in a recession since November of 2001, and we had the strongest GDP growth rate of about any industrialized nation in the world last year. How can you justify running deficits of that size when we don't have a recession and when you can only explain a small percentage of the deficit based upon our global war against terrorism? The answer is you can't justify it. It is fundamentally imprudent. If we were a company, we would be out of business. We are not a company. We are a country. But that does not mean that we should not take this seriously. Because the fact of the matter is, no great republic in the history of the world has lasted more than 300 years. Rome lasted over 1,000, but less than 300 as a republic. And why? Several reasons. One of which was because people realized after a while that you could have things today and pay for them tomorrow. But sooner or later, the crunch comes. And we are on a very imprudent and irresponsible fiscal path. Tough choices are going to have to get made. Now, if you look at the financial statements of the U.S. government as of the end of last fiscal year, September 30, by the way, these are in billions. So when you see a number, let's take debt held by government accounts, 3,071, that's $3,071 billion. And keep in mind, trillions have 12 zeros. It's just kind of hard to figure it out. 12 zeros, all right? And a number that and these have been updated for the latest Social Security and Medicare trustees report, by the way, that came out about a month ago. But bottom line is, if you looked at the total liabilities, which includes debt, as well as unfunded promises for Social Security, Medicare, and a few other items, we currently have accumulated liabilities and unfunded obligations of well over $40 trillion and growing every day. The number for Social Security is about $4 trillion based on the latest estimates. Social Security is less than 10% of our problem. It's a problem that needs to be solved. I'm happy to answer questions on it. I used to be a trustee of Social Security and Medicare. I've been on 2 Social Security reform commissions. Frankly, it ought to be easy to reform Social Security. And that's one of the reasons that we ought to solve it. Even though it's less than 10% of the problem, there's a positive outcome you can get there to give credibility, momentum, to take on tougher issues. Medicare, about 30 trillion. 30 trillion imbalance. And last year, our total liabilities and unfunded commitments went up over $13 trillion in 1 year, primarily due to the passage of the Medicare prescription drug bill. That one bill was estimated to cost $8.1 trillion, and the entire debt of the United States outstanding is only about $7.5 trillion. So that one bill was estimated to cost more than all of the accumulated debt outstanding since the beginning of the Republic in 1789. By the way, nobody debated that $8 trillion number. It wasn't debated. How do these numbers translate to something you can relate to? Well, the $45 trillion number, which is the latest estimate, is about $150,000 a person or $365,000 per full-time worker. So in other words, for those of you that are full-time workers, if I passed a hat, you'd have to write a check that would clear for $365,000. It would not be tax deductible, and it wouldn't solve the problem forever. All right? The average family income in the United States is $42,000. So you compare that to $365,000. Compare $45 trillion to the fact that the entire U.S. economy is only about $11 to $12 trillion a year. It's almost 20 times the federal budget, 20 years worth of federal budgets. These are big numbers. It's a serious problem. Now, let's look forward. One of the things that we've been doing at GAO since the early 90s, in part because the Comptroller General has a 15-year term, and I don't personally believe the world's going to end in 5 years or 10 years, which tends to be what the budget horizons are. They tend to look out 1 year, 5 years, 10 years. It's kind of like the flat earth theory. You know, you don't have to worry beyond that. Well, I think we've proved the earth is round. So we do have to worry beyond that. The other thing that we know is we have a demographic tsunami, a demographic tidal wave, which is the retirement of the baby boom generation, which begins in 2008, rises, represents a permanent change in the demographic landscape of this country, which can swamp the ship of state if we are not careful. Now, this is based upon the Congressional Budget Office's economic assumptions. It's based upon the Social Security and Medicare trustees' best estimate of what their spending on those programs are going to be. But it's also based upon several other key assumptions which I would respectfully suggest that even though CBO is required to make them, are fundamentally unrealistic. Now let me test you on it. The first assumption, that in the next 35 years, no new legislation will pass. Okay? The second assumption, that discretionary spending, which includes national defense, homeland security, education, transportation, infrastructure, judicial system, GAO, etc., will grow by the rate of inflation. How many people believe that? Okay? Let's keep going. The third assumption is that every tax cut that has been enacted within the last several years will expire when it's scheduled to expire, and none will be extended. How many people believe that? All right, we're on a roll. The fourth is that the alternative minimum tax, which is now reaching more and more Americans every year, which was intended to deal with the wealthy, is now, because it's not indexed, reaching down to affect middle America, will not be fixed. How many people believe that? All right, well, if you believe all those things, this is a pretty realistic assumption. But you don't believe any of them. I don't believe any of them. Guess what? This is what Washington uses to make decisions. This is what they use to make decisions. This is another alternative scenario. Starting with the same economic growth assumptions, but we've got a feedback mechanism, so obviously if you continue to run big deficits, then it has an adverse effect on economic growth. If you make two changes, number one, discretionary spending grows by the rate of the economy rather than the rate of inflation. That's why the green bar is the same size. And all tax cuts are made permanent. This is the scenario. The U.S. government can do little more than pay interest on the large and massive and growing debt in 2040. People that are worried about the Social Security Trust Fund in 2041, that is a small subset of our problem. Our entire fiscal situation could be melting down by then. This is an Argentina scenario. Frankly, anything in between these, depending upon where you are, could be an Argentina fiscal meltdown scenario. Now, what I would respectfully suggest, what this shows is the status quo is not an option. Additional economic growth can help, but we're not going to grow our way out of the problem. The math just doesn't work. And thirdly, the sooner we get started, the better, because right now the miracle of compounding is working against us. Debt on debt is not good. Unlike the miracle of compounding where you have return on investments and the miracle of compounding there, which is good, debt on debt is not good. So what is the way forward? First, how we keep score does not provide a full and fair view of where we are and where we're headed. We need to change our accounting and reporting rules, we need to change our budget rules, and we need to have more budget control. The part of the thing that John touched on before was the fact in the 1990s we had very serious budget controls that were in place on both the spending side and the tax side. That before you could end up enacting new spending increases or tax cuts, they had to pay for themselves. And if they didn't pay for themselves, you couldn't do it. Those expired. Congress is about ready to reenact spending controls, which is a positive thing, but they're exempting the tax side. Well, you know, if you're trying to control the bottom line, you can't exempt one side of the ledger. You've got to consider both the revenue side and the tax side. Now, don't get me wrong. I don't like tax increases. I don't know of anybody who likes tax increases. And that should not be the first resort. But the fact of the matter is, the first rule of holes is you got to stop digging. And you need to be able to have controls on both sides of the ledger in order to help assure that you're stopping digging. Then you can decide where you go from here. Secondly, we need some metrics for measuring where the United States stands, how we're doing, how we compare to others. We don't have them. Canada has them, Australia has them, UK has them, Netherlands has them, EU has them. I'm talking about economic, safety, security, environmental, and other kinds of social measures, outcome-based measures on where we are, where we're headed, and how we compare. Why? Because we don't know whether the trillions of dollars we're spending, either on spending or tax incentives, are working or not. We don't know. And therefore, without knowing that, the answer is, well, throw some more spending at it, or give another tax cut, and that's got to be the answer. Well, the answer is, you know, sometimes tax incentives don't encourage the behavior you want. Not every tax cut is prudent. Not every tax cut stimulates the economy, and not every spending increase makes a difference. You need to understand what works and what doesn't work, because quite frankly, we can't afford the status quo. These are a lot of details I'm not going to get into. What are we going to have to do other than change how we keep score, figuring out what some key indicators are, trying to understand what works and what doesn't work? We are going to have to restructure Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. No question about it. The government is not going to be able to deliver on all the promises it has made. We can talk about how those things are likely to get restructured. People that are 55 or even 55 and older shouldn't worry about Social Security. They probably shouldn't worry much about Medicare either. But for people who are under 55, need to be concerned to differing degrees about both, because there's no way the government's going to deliver on all those promises. Secondly, we need to re-examine the base of discretionary and other spending, including defense and homeland security. They have been giving a pass from budget constraints recently. The crunch is coming. And we're going to have to relook at, make sure that we're making prudent expenditures there as well. We're going to have to look at tax policy and enforcement programs. In many years, the total value of tax preferences, tax incentives, whether they be a deduction or exclusion, the total value exceeds how much we spend on discretionary spending, and yet it's off the radar screen. We don't know whether they're working or they're not working. The other thing is we're going to have to start targeting tax preferences and spending programs to those most in need, rather than trying to give it to everybody or a broad cross-section because we can't afford it and we can't sustain it. I think from a practical standpoint, given where we are from a fiscal standpoint, every additional dollar of debt today is a tax increase for tomorrow, because we have structural deficits. It's not a matter if there's going to be a tax increase, and again, I'm not pro-tax increases. It's not a matter if there's going to be a tax increase, it's only a matter of when, in what form, and how much. And quite candidly, I'm not as concerned about this for me. I'm concerned about this for my 2 kids, and I got married at 19, so I have 2 grandkids. I'm concerned about it for them, because we are on an imprudent and unsustainable path that threatens our nation's, our children's, and our grandchildren's future. And by the way, in fairness, we had long-range structural deficits even when we had surpluses. We had long-range deficits even when we had surpluses. And so this is not new, although the deficits are worse, they're more immediate. And the long-range imbalance is worse. We issued a report on February 16th. I would encourage you to go to our website, which is www.gao.gov. That's www.gao.gov. There's a report that was issued called 21st Century Challenges, Reexamining the Base of the Federal Government. It's a pretty quick read. It builds a case on where we are, where we're headed, and it also has a hypothesis, which I believe strongly is true. And that is, a vast majority of the federal government's policies, programs, functions, and activities are based upon conditions that existed when they were put into place and enacted into law. And in many cases, that's the 1950s and the 1960s. The management model, the compensation systems, the definition of disability, many of our defense programs are based upon conditions that existed in the 50s and 60s. And they have not been reviewed, reprioritized, re-engineered, merged, terminated, whatever, to recognize 21st century realities. That's got to happen. These are some of the questions that are in the report. Time doesn't allow me to go through all this. These are the areas that are covered in the report. You'll see it's very comprehensive and it's balanced. It's not just the spending side, it's also the tax side. It's defense and domestic spending. These are some examples of the questions, but time doesn't allow me to go through these. I really want to get to Q&A. I want to come back just for a second on the key national indicators. Why do we need key national indicators? We're spending trillions of dollars and given hundreds of billions of dollars in tax preferences every year, and we don't really know what works and what doesn't work. Tough choices are going to have to be made. Key indicators can help inform strategic planning, enhance performance accountability reporting, and facilitate more informed decisions with regard to tax policy, spending, regulatory policy, the tough choices that are going to have to be made. I personally believe that we are not going to have these choices made until after the American people understand where we are and where we're headed. Because you can't run a country by committee. And there are really tough choices that are going to have to be made, and realistically, elected officials are not going to get too far out ahead of the American people. The American people have to get the facts, they have to understand where we're at, they need nonpartisan facts so we can end up achieving bipartisan solutions. And that's one of the reasons I'm speaking to you here today. Social Security, let me show you this, and Medicare. The yellow is Social Security, the blue is Medicare. This represents cash flow. In other words, the difference between the payroll taxes coming in primarily and the spending going out. You can see Medicare is already in a negative cash flow. We're already drawing down on those bonds. You can see that Social Security is expected to start having declining surpluses starting in 2008. What does that mean? The government's used to spending that money. There's going to be less of it relatively to spend. That's going to put pressure on the balance of the budget. You can see that Social Security starts running a negative cash flow in 2017. So rather than Social Security subsidizing the rest of the budget, money's going to have to come from the rest of the budget to subsidize Social Security. And so the idea that 2041 is the date we need to be worried about is a false premise. We need to be concerned way before 2041. At the same point in time, even when the trust fund runs dry in 2041, and by the way, it isn't a real trust fund, it's an accounting device. Even when the trust fund runs dry in 2041, Social Security still has 73 cents in income for every dollar in promised benefits. So it's not bankrupt. It's never bankrupt. It will be insolvent because it won't be able to pay its debt, full debts, when due. But bankrupt as it relates to being total inability to pay any claims, it will never be. These are the key dates. 2009, the surpluses start to decline. 2017, negative cash flow. 2041, the trust fund is exhausted. But remember the scenario I showed you before about the United States budget? This is less than 10% of our problem, and so we shouldn't take much solace in what the status of the trust fund is, because we have serious problems we need to start dealing with sooner rather than later. This is the growth in Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid as a percentage of the economy. There's a similar trend pattern on the percentage of the budget. So I think that's enough for you right now. What I'd like to do is to try to get to Q&A. I think somebody told me this morning when I was giving this talk to all the admirals in the Coast Guard and all the senior executives in the Coast Guard, and I had other materials I covered too on Homeland Security and a variety of other materials. They said that I should pass out Excedrins. And that gave me a good idea, because there's actually various good government organizations that are going to pull together and form a consortium to have sessions in major cities around the country to get some of these facts out. Maybe they can be a sponsor. Excedrin could be the sponsor of the session. It's probably not a bad idea, but anyway, so. All right, why don't we go to questions?
My name's Peter Gisella, and I've been interested in the concept of a national service program for 26 years. 25 years ago, Leon Panetta agreed with me that a well-designed national service program could motivate this country to become more government efficient and address the problems of poverty in this country. But nothing's happened, and Leon got into the power structure, and he could have pursued it from that perspective, but he went with the flow.
Well,
the question is,
what about national service?
National service as a means to educate the public to these financial situations and deal with the problems in our society, but also he's called for a top-down restructuring of the government, and that would be a way to reprocess the whole government to do that, with the internet as a means to structure that.
Two issues. One issue is what's going to happen in order to get us where tough choices are made on this, and second, national service. On the first one, it's going to take a national education campaign, leveraging the internet, leveraging the media, leveraging a variety of good government groups, the business community, other people who care about the future. It's going to take the combined efforts of a number of people over a number of years. Academia's got to play a part in this. I would respectfully suggest that the students have a vested interest in this, because they're going to pay twice if people don't make decisions on this. They're going to pay twice. Taxes could go up 2.5 times under this scenario. By the way, this is just federal. California's a basket case. All right? You know how California defines balancing the budget under the Constitution? Borrowing money to make up the difference. That's not balancing a budget. That's balancing cash flows. We are doing work right now to find out how serious the problem is with the states and localities. It's serious, although it varies. And so we have a real issue. National service. My personal opinion is that there ought to be a national service requirement.
It's a voluntary,
but different than a draft. The reason that progress hasn't been made on a national service requirement is most people equate that to a draft. We had a mandatory service requirement before. It only applied to males, and it only dealt with the military. Many countries have thought about national service requirements. I think we're ultimately going to have to, in a broader sense, define national service much more broadly than the military. You could work for a not-for-profit, you could work for the government, you could work for, you could be a teacher, you could do, where we have skills needs and where there are supply and demand imbalances. Define it much more broadly and think about having a national service requirement which could include the military, but not only the military. I think that it could accomplish a number of different objectives. It is not anywhere close to being on the priority list for consideration right now, but maybe in time it will be.
And it could also include seniors.
Oh, absolutely. The biggest untapped resource this country has is seniors. The fastest growing part of the population we have is seniors. And by the way, I think in time there's going to have to be reconsideration to the normal retirement age for Social Security and Medicare in order to encourage people to work longer. Not to require them to work longer, to encourage them to work longer. Yes?
So if these problems aren't fixed, what will happen? You mentioned a Argentina-like scenario. Could you elaborate on that?
Well, I mean, Argentina had hyperinflation. Argentina defaulted on its debt. There are many people who ended up losing a significant amount of their savings. On and on and on, okay? Here's my concern. My concern is that we've seen a significant decline in the dollar in the last 2 years. That may be a warning shot across the bow. Secondly, you would think that with that significant decline in the dollar, then our trade balance would be getting better. But it isn't, all right? Thirdly, last year, if you look at our deficits and debt, over 90% of our debt was purchased by foreign players, some of which who have different national security, foreign policy, and economic security interests to us. If they decide they don't want to finance our deficits and debt to the extent they have in the past, where are we going to get the money? Because we have the lowest savings rate of any major industrialized nation. The answer is we'd have to pay higher interest rates in order to be able to attract money. That's the way the markets work. If you pay higher interest rates, then you exacerbate your problem. And so, we don't totally control our own destiny now because we're relying upon others to fund our consumption. The other scenario is we increase taxes 2.5 times to fund the status quo scenario, recognizing that that's only at the federal level, and you got to deal with the state problems and the local problems too. That would have a devastating impact on economic growth, on standard of living, I go on and on. And ultimately our national security. Because you've got to have a strong economy to have a strong national security. You've got to have a strong economy in order to improve quality of life for people. So to the extent that these things ultimately end up undermining our economy, then there are a lot of other unacceptable outcomes that come from that. Okay.
I'm curious whether the GAO has any other plans or missions for approaching this problem besides a public education campaign. Because my concern is that politicians seem to be, you're battling the fact that major politicians are seemingly purposefully spreading misinformation about this problem.
Well, in fairness, part of the problem is that the way that we keep score didn't provide them with a full and fair view. When I say we, I don't mean GAO. I mean the Congress's own rules, et cetera. And so I've been encouraging them to change how they keep score, to change the rules. We issue reports every day. And the reports that we issue every day that talk about how to improve government performance and how to, enhance accountability in government, they're all informed by the trends that are affecting the United States, including the fiscal imbalance. And so we issue reports that bring this home, that make recommendations. The 21st Century Challenges report, I hope, will end up helping to stimulate action both within the executive branch as well as the legislative branch. That report has over 200 illustrative questions that need to be asked and answered about government programs, policies, functions, and activities. It's a great research agenda, you know, for academia, for PhD dissertations. It's also a great agenda for GAO to be able to do work to support the Congress too. So we're doing lots of things. By no means are we putting all our eggs in one basket. By the way, the public education campaign is not a GAO campaign. You know, we'll play our part, but many, many, many other people are involved in this. Yes?
I'd just be interested on an international perspective. Other industrial societies have different tax programs, obviously, and different social welfare programs, but some of what you're talking about is demographically generated.
Right.
Compared to, say, for instance, the European Union,
Sure.
which I think it makes sense to, talk about that as though it were a single national economy, or will in the future. How do they stand on these issues compared to us?
Very good question, and one of the things that we are doing at GAO with increasing frequency is that we are looking outside our borders, because the U.S. is number one in many things. We're not number one in all things. We need to learn from others as to what's worked for them, what have they done, share successes, avoid pitfalls. In that regard, next week I'm going to be in Canada meeting with 15 of my counterparts, including a number from Europe. One of the items on the agenda is going to be this, and we're going to talk about what have they done. Let me tell you, the answer is simple. Number one, some countries have better or worse demographic outlooks than we do. Some of the ones in Europe have worse ones, all right? Some better, some about the same. At the same point in time, some of them have already started to deal with their problem. Some of them have already started to restructure their entitlement programs in other areas. But in the final analysis, I don't take a whole lot of solace in the fact that some may be worse off than we are. What's important is that we try to take the bull by the horns and control our own destiny, that we share knowledge and experience, and that we try to be ahead of the curve rather than behind the curve. I'll give you a quote that, don't attribute it to me, I don't know who said it, but it struck me. You know, there are some people that say, well, we shouldn't have to worry because other people are worse than we are, therefore don't worry about it. My answer is, what good does it do to be the best looking horse in the glue factory? I wouldn't take much solace in that, okay? And so we need to control our own destiny.
Hello, thank you. First, a really quick question. On that, I think it was $30 trillion long-term unfunded liabilities. What's the horizon on that? Is that...
All right, let's talk about what that means. That is a discounted present value dollar number. All right, the total number is about 45 trillion, of which I think Medicare is about 30, Social Security is 4. That's how much money you would have to have today invested at Treasury rates to close the gap between promises and revenue streams for 75 years, and only for 75 years. It would not solve the problem, and that's part of the demographic problem. The reason being is, right now, for every year we drop a Social Security surplus year, and we add an increasingly bad deficit year because of known demographic trends. And for Medicare, same kind of trend, although we're starting with deficits and ending with worse deficits.
Okay. May I ask another quickie? Thank you. It's, as far as the trade deficit, something you didn't really get into, I recently spoke with an editor of a major financial publication who said that he wishes the federal government wouldn't even publish those figures anymore because it has nothing to do with the economy, that Germany has a trade surplus, but they're a mess. So, you know, and it seems like that must be a common opinion among some people, you know, in Washington and in New York, because certainly you see people really trying to poo-poo the trade deficit. So how do you deal with these people, and what do you say to them?
I focus more on the balance of payments deficit, which is capital flows, and the trade is a subset of that, okay? I get more concerned with that, okay? You know, my view is it comes back to we need a broader portfolio of indicators. There's not one indicator that is a magic bullet, okay? But no matter what indicators you want to pick, we're flashing red right now, okay? Or at least flashing yellow, moving to flashing red, okay?
Thanks.
I'm not a professional in this, but I wonder if you would consider what it seems to me, looking back over many years, to be a kind of a new factor, something that is really different about our economy now, and that is the enormous amount of cash that's available. We've seen home prices go to historic levels. Home ownership levels are at very high levels. And this is true, well, if we're getting all of this money from the Japanese and Chinese and EU to buy our bonds, they must have this money. So here at a time when we have historic levels of debt, we also have historic low interest rates. And I think that this is kind of an anomaly. How do you explain that? And isn't this a new factor somehow?
Yeah.
That there's enormous amounts of money washing around, sloshing around in our economies, and also Japanese and the EU.
Well, a lot of the increase in net worth in the United States has come in the form of home equity. Not all home equity is monetized. You know, some people try to monetize it through taking out home equity loans or whatever else. And just to give you a sense, the total estimated net worth of every American in the United States, including Warren Buffett and Bill Gates, is $48.5 trillion.
Trillion?
Trillion. $48.5 trillion, counting home equity. The number I gave you before of our total liabilities and unfunded commitments at the federal level is $45 trillion. All right? The reason, but with regard to others having money and us not having money, savings rates. If you look at the savings rates for individuals in particular, in Japan and in Asia in general, they're much, much higher than ours. Their society is such, and it has been for many decades, that they think more about tomorrow. They don't just focus on today. And as a result, you will see that they don't consume as much today as we do, and they save much more today for tomorrow than we do. That could be one of the reasons why their GDP growth rate is, in the case of Japan, is somewhat less. There are a lot of reasons. It's a very complicated issue. But, they have significant savings from their current income to be able to save for tomorrow. A lot of our net worth increase has been home equity. I hope the housing prices continue to go up, but I can't see how they can continue to go up at the rate they've been going up. All right? And as you know, here in California, you got what, Prop 13, or what is it, Prop 13, that even though the values are going up, the tax base is frozen and or limited as to how much it can go up, which is causing some problems, I guess, for y'all here that ultimately you're going to have to come to reckon with. Okay? Thank you.
You mentioned all the GAO reports that come out each day, and I was wondering how the agency tries to balance potentially conflicting objectives. I mean, on one hand, members of Congress are constantly requesting reports from you guys, and on the other hand, you mentioned all these topics that seem incredibly pressing that members of Congress might not request.
Well, first, 90% of the reports that we issue are either mandated by Congress through a law or requested by Congress, typically committees, chairs, or ranking members. 10% are based upon my own authority and my own initiative. All of them, we hope, are informed by this strategic plan, which we prepare in conjunction with the Congress. And one of the reasons that we publish documents like the 21st Century Challenges and the High Risk List is to increase the likelihood that we're going to get asked to do work in areas of importance that can make a difference. And for the most part, that works. 85 to 87% of the work that we did last year tied in some way back to the strategic plan because we're having ongoing communications with our client. Now, what's important is the client can ask us to do work in a particular area, but after they ask us to do the work, it's ours. All right, we do it in accordance with professional standards and core values. Core values include, integrity, which means professional, objective, fact-based, nonpartisan, non-ideological, fair, and balanced. We won't just look at what the negative aspect of something is, we'll also look at the positive. We'll consider it in the context of other work that we've done, other work that we're doing, other work that we're planning to do. And we have all kinds of mechanisms within GAO to try to make sure that the right people are involved, to maximize the chance that that our work is going to be of top quality and make a difference. By the way, within the last 2 weeks, we've had 2 peer reviews reports, the results of peer reviews on us done. One was done on our financial audit practice by KPMG, clean opinion, no material control weaknesses, number of global best practices. Another one was done by a multinational team led by Canada, involving 7 countries of supreme audit institutions, of our performance audit practice, policy analysis, clean opinion, no material control weaknesses, a number of global best practices. So, we're constantly trying to, maintain our reputation, because we're only as good as our reputation. By the way, that brings me back to Arthur Andersen for a second. You're talking about reputation. I talked about reputation. I was with Andersen for 9.5 years. When I was with Andersen, not because I was with Andersen, when I was with Andersen, they were the best firm in the world, what they did. They were the global gold standard, and they were even viewed that way by their competitors. Andersen was in business for almost 90 years. They went from global gold standard to gone in less than 2 years. Why? A lot of reasons, but several are important. One, a few people didn't do their job. They didn't do what was right. Management didn't take it seriously enough. Government overreacted. The firm's out of business. It's really, really important that when you're in the trust business, which we are, we're in the trust business. CPAs are in the trust business in the private sector. It takes decades to build a positive reputation. It can be lost very quickly if a few people don't do the right thing, if management doesn't take it seriously and do the right thing, and if government overreacts, which is what happened. So we got to learn from that. Thank you.